As soon as I stepped onto the property, I should have seen that something wasn't quite right. I had been there before, you see, but this time there was a sense of tension, a gravity that seemed different. When I got there, I saw it in my nephew's eyes. This time, his eyes lingered too long, and his smile looked a bit too knowing, even though we had always been close, almost like siblings, despite the age difference. From my perspective, the beginning was innocent enough. I had come to the farm to assist with the chores for a few weeks, and to be honest, I needed a break from the bustle of the city because this area had always been my haven. It was where I came to find calm, the vast fields, the distant noises of animals, the simplicity of it all. But this time, when I got off the bus and saw my nephew waiting to fetch me, I didn't find tranquility. Something wasn't right. Aside from a few remarks about how much the farmhouse had changed since my last visit, the ride was largely silent. My nephew kept stealing glances at me, his hands gripping the wheel just a bit too tightly. He was taller now and he was also broader, but it wasn't just his physical presence that caught my attention. It was the way he looked at me, as if he was seeing me for the first time, as if I had changed. I attributed it to his enthusiasm. He had always been ecstatic when I went there, but when we got there, I secretly experienced the first tremors. My brother and his wife had been out of town for a few weeks, leaving my nephew to run the farmhouse, so it was just the two of us. The farmhouse looked the same as always. Rustic, cozy, and tucked away in the middle of nowhere. At that moment, I didn't give it much thought. Ultimately, what could possibly go wrong when we were the only two on a farm? Those initial days went by. Our mornings were uneventfully spent caring for the animals, repairing various barn components, and checking on the crops. We would gaze up at the sky while sitting on the porch at night. I started to notice something during those silent times, although we were chatting about everything and nothing at the same time. It was unnerving to hear my nephew talk to me because he had confidence in his voice that I had never heard before. We were sitting on the porch one evening when he abruptly turned to face me and remarked, "You know, you look different now." I'm not sure what it is. He was taunting me, so I laughed it off, but there was something in his tone that made my skin tingle. He didn't let it go, so I responded that I'm still the same person and tried to keep the conversation light. "No, you aren't. You've changed," he said, leaning closer and making eye contact with me that made my heart accelerate. Breaking the tension, I said, "I'm going to bed," and turned away before he could say anything more. However, as soon as I entered the home, I couldn't get rid of the sense that something was developing between us, something I wasn't prepared to deal with the following morning. The situation appeared to stabilize. Although we resumed our routine, the unease persisted. Like a shadow overhanging us, it became deeper every day as my nephew's looks increased in frequency, and his touches got more informal but still too personal. The day that changed everything occurred when I convinced myself that I was only dreaming, and that it was all in my brain, even though I knew deep down that I wasn't. We had been working in the barn for hours, and it was a hot day with heavy, thick air. My nephew recommended that we take a break since I was tired and my muscles hurt from the exertion, and I accepted, grateful for the opportunity to relax the shade while enjoying refreshing beverages. Our initial quiet moment was delightful, until he posed a question that halted my heart. "Do you ever consider us?" "Really consider us, I mean?" I blinked, not understanding what he was talking about. I asked, attempting to sound steady. He remained silent. Instead, he looked at me for a long time with deep, dark eyes. He talked in a low, nearly whispery voice when he did. "You and I aren't that." The words lingered in the air between us, heavy with significance, and I was at a loss for words. "But you know that we are more akin than you believe." Telling him made me giggle. Even though he was being absurd, something in his eyes stopped me, and I immediately recognized that this was genuine and that I couldn't deny it any longer. With my pulse racing, I hurried to my feet. My nephew remained still as I stumbled and backed away from him, saying, "I need to go." As though he was waiting, he simply sat there and watched me with that same focused glance, as if he knew. I turned and rushed back to the house, my mind racing so I could figure it out. I told myself that I was exaggerating and that I was only dreaming, but I knew in my heart that something had changed between us, and I wasn't sure if I could reverse it. However, the narrative doesn't stop there. On the contrary, this was only the beginning. It was going to shake me to my very core, forcing me to face feelings I had buried deep inside. Feelings I wasn't ready to face, But there was more, much more, and soon I would realize that the line between right and wrong had never been as clear as I thought. The days that followed were tense, full of an energy I couldn't ignore, and I tried to act like nothing had changed, but the truth was that everything had. It wasn't just the words my nephew had said to me that afternoon. It was the way he looked at me now, as if he was waiting for me to acknowledge what was happening between us. I wanted to act like everything was normal, and that we were simply family, but it was becoming more difficult every day. I didn't want to admit it. In an attempt to avoid any unpleasant talks, I got up early the following morning. I reasoned that if I kept myself occupied, I wouldn't have to think about his gaze on me that day. The barn had to be cleaned either before or the way my pulse had pounded in reaction. There was always something to do on the farm. The animals needed to be cared for. I dove myself into the duties, wanting to bury myself in the rhythm of the job, but he naturally found me. I hated that I was reacting this way, that my body was betraying me, and that he usually did it around noon, when the sun was high in the sky and the heat was beating down on the fields. When I saw him coming, my heart accelerated. He did not. Initially, they remained silent and observed me while I raked the hay into tidy stacks. My gaze remained fixed on the ground, reluctant to recognize his presence, concentrating on the work at hand. But then he said in a low, informal voice, "You've been avoiding me." I halted, my hands tightening their grasp on the rake. "You haven't been evading me." I lied with full knowledge that I had been doing just that, "and you insisted on getting closer. Ever since that day you have changed." I hurriedly answered, "Nothing's different," as I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. He cocked his head too fast, his eyes narrowing as though he could see straight through me. "You are aware that's untrue." Between us, his words lingered in the air. I was speechless and unsure of how to react to the intensity of his stare, which was weighed down by a truth I didn't want to face. A part of me wanted to flee to get as far away from him as possible, but another part of me, one I wasn't proud of, wanted to remain. I dropped the rake and backed away, my hands trembling a little. Even though we both knew it wasn't true, he wasn't backing down and continued to take steps toward me while maintaining eye contact. "I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered. "I can sense that something shifted between us that day, and you felt it too. I know you're afraid to acknowledge it, but it's true." I started to object, to tell him that nothing had changed, but I restrained myself because I had sensed that he was correct, and that scared me. Shaking, I said, "I can't do this." I turned my head away from him. "This is wrong. You're my nephew." Instead of flinching, he took another stride toward us, bringing us closer. "I'm no longer a child," he said, his voice barely audible over a whisper. "You must stop treating me in this manner. You are aware that terror and something else, which I would not identify, were causing my heart to race in my chest." I was unable to ignore the fact that he was no longer a child. He was now a man, and that realization was what most alarmed me. He stretched out, then his palm touched my arm and I startled at the contact. I replied, my voice shaking, "I don't know what you want from me, but this couldn't be happening." However, I felt a sort of exhilaration inside of me that I couldn't quite place. It was just a touch. It wasn't very intimate, but it was enough to make me feel a shock of excitement. "We don't have to do anything you don't want," he added in a soft voice as I stepped back, my breath seizing in my throat. "It's almost comforting, yet you can't deny that we have a connection." With tears burning the corners of my eyes, I shook my head, saying, "You feel it just as much as I do." My voice was almost heard as I continued, "It doesn't matter what I feel. It's incorrect." "Why is it incorrect?" he inquired in a sincere manner, as though he was unaware of the seriousness of what he was recommending. His remarks made me shiver, but we're both adults, and nobody else is around or needs to know. Nobody else needs to know how simple it is or how he made it seem so innocent and simple, but it wasn't. Indeed, it was anything but simple. "But I couldn't help myself," I said, turning my back on him, my hands trembling as I attempted to calm my pounding heart. I had to leave, but he was there, his fingers softly holding my wrist. Pulling me back toward him, he said in a quiet, begging voice, "Please don't go. We can talk about this. Just don't run away." I was unsure about what to do. There was a part of me that wanted to run away from the intensity of the situation, but I also felt a desire to stay. A portion I didn't want to acknowledge existed. Something like a storm gaining power has been developing ever since I got there. He freed my wrist as time went on, but he remained where I was, stuck in the thick of it all. I felt the weight of his stare, the unsaid promise of something more, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could resist it. Instead, he stood there observing me. For a brief time, his eyes softened, and I noticed something I hadn't noticed before: vulnerability. "I know this is confusing," he murmured, his voice barely audible above a whisper. "But I've never felt this way before, not about anyone, not like this." He spoke with sincerity and raw honesty that I couldn't ignore, and his words struck me more than I had anticipated. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't simply a passing infatuation. Rather, it was something more profound and genuine, but that didn't make it right. In an attempt to gather my strength and accomplish what I knew I had to do, I inhaled deeply. He must have nodded, but I could see the regret in his eyes as I replied, "I need some space." "Take all the time you need," he said quietly, "but please don't ignore me." I remained silent. I couldn't. I turned and walked instead. My thoughts were racing. Something had changed between us. I walked back to the house, my heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The fact that I couldn't sleep that night was something I couldn't ignore, but I wasn't sure whether I could handle it. The stifling quiet of the farmhouse burdened me as I lay there. Every floorboard creak and distant animal sound from the barn, as I stared up at the darkness ceiling in bed, just served to intensify the chaos in my mind. I continued playing over the exchange with my nephew, his words reverberating in my head. "There is something between us that you can't deny." I couldn't refute that he was correct, which was the hardest part. I had experienced the same attraction, the same weird bond, but I had been too afraid to acknowledge it. Even though it wasn't meant to be this way or between us, something inside of me had changed, and I couldn't return to acting as though nothing had occurred. By morning, I had not gotten any closer. I woke up early in an attempt to put some space between us in hopes that if I ignored him and concentrated on the farm work, I might suppress these feelings, but I knew deep down that I couldn't. He was unrelenting and persistent forever, making it hard to ignore him. By midday, when the heat was oppressive, I was out in the fields trying to divert my attention with the crops, but my thoughts kept returning to him. It seemed as though he was constantly present, hovering on the periphery of my consciousness, and then I heard him coming. From behind me, he called out, his tone low and informal as though nothing had transpired between us, but I knew now that nothing had. Instead, I gently turned around, preparing myself for the tension that always seemed to grow when we were by ourselves. He was standing a few feet away. He continued to study me with his hard eyes, but this time a gentler look filled his face, causing my heart to race in a way I hadn't anticipated. "I thought we could chat," he said, stepping closer, "about everything." I paused, my heart racing. Though the words rang hollow even as I spoke them, "I don't think there is anything to discuss." Of course there was something to discuss. We both understood that everything had changed. "That's not true. We can't continue to act as though nothing is going on," he said, shaking his head while maintaining eye contact. "Do you not feel it too?" I felt my throat constricted. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, to put a stop to this once and for all. But the tension was too great while he was standing so close to me and staring at me so honestly. Between us felt like it was about to burst after growing for too long. What to say is a mystery to me. He simply took a step closer, reducing the gap, while I stumbled and retreated a step. He said in a low, personal voice that made my spine tingle, "Between us, you don't have to say anything. Just listen." And before I could even respond, he leaned closer. My breath caught in my throat as his face drew nearer. His lips inches from mine, and I froze. I should have retreated. For a minute, it seemed as though everything else had vanished, as if we were the only two people in the world, and then his lips met mine. Instead of stopping him, I stayed there, my heart pounding, the world slowing down around us. Mine was gentle at first, little more than a whisper of a kiss, yet it was enough to make my head spin. I hadn't anticipated it. I hadn't let myself believe it would reach this point, but now that it was happening, I couldn't seem to stop it. His lips came closer to mine, and I experienced a surge of heat that was simultaneously overpowering and perplexing. I returned his kiss for a brief moment. The reaction I couldn't control was instinctive, yet it was sufficient to break down the flimsy barrier I had erected around myself. All I had been fighting for days suddenly surfaced in that one moment. The tension, the magnetism, the unquestionable connection we had been avoiding for days. When our lips briefly met, it was all there, exposed, yet I withdrew as fast as it had started. I tripped. My pulse was thumping in my chest, and my mind was spinning with 1,000 ideas that I couldn't comprehend. I know, I said, shaking my head as if I could somehow reverse the events that had just transpired. Even though his face was unreadable, I could tell how intensely he was staring at me. Silently, he murmured, "You can't act like you didn't feel it. I'm certain you did." I tried to stabilize myself by taking a trembling breath. No matter how I felt, this couldn't and wouldn't happen. But why did he ask in a gentle yet firm voice? Why must it be incorrect? We are not in pain. I was shocked that he was saying this to anyone. The fact that we were even having this talk surprised me. The world appeared to be disintegrating beneath me. I trembled and murmured, "You're my nephew and we're family." "It's incorrect." He shook his head. His stiffening attitude made me shudder. "We're not like that, not really," he said. He was so confident in himself that he thought our actions were somehow justified, but I knew otherwise. I should have known better. It was impossible. I was unable to allow it. I stated again more firmly, "I can't." He stayed there watching me with that same focused look, and I could feel the hurt seeping into his eyes. "I won't say anything for a long time." However, after a hesitant nod, he added softly, "Okay, if that's what you want." It wasn't exactly what I wanted, but it was necessary, so I turned and left, my heart beating. I turned away. I couldn't risk seeing the anguish in his eyes, or worse, the need that reflected mine. When I returned to the farmhouse, I went directly to my room, leaning against the door and closing it behind me as though I could somehow keep everything outside. However, it was too late. The damage had already been done, the boundary between us had been crossed, and no matter how hard I tried to tell myself otherwise, there was no turning back. But that was by no means the end. The tension between us had not dissipated. Rather, it had only intensified and become more perilous, and it would soon unravel around us in unexpected ways, as the kiss had only marked the beginning. The days that followed were intolerable, and I couldn't stop it even if I wanted to. Even though the kiss was brief, it ripped through me like a raging fire. The sensation of his lips on mine, the ferocity in his gaze, and the unsaid promise that had persisted between us all tormented me, took over my life. I knew that it had been a mistake, but that didn't make it any easier to forget. What was worse? Even though the kiss was brief, it ripped through me like a raging fire, to be in as much pain as I was whenever we crossed paths. His eyes followed me steadily and calmly as if he was waiting for me to break, but I couldn't and wouldn't give in. By the end of the week, I had exhausted both mentally and physically from the long days and sleepless nights, but no amount of work could undo what had transpired between us. I was anxious and kept questioning whether I should have handled things differently, but there was no turning back now. He was waiting for me on the porch one evening when I got back to the farmhouse from a particularly taxing day in the fields. His presence made my heart sink. I was not prepared for another altercation, not after all that had previously transpired. I also simply wanted to vanish, discover a way to get away from the tension that had been escalating between us like a storm on the horizon. He remained silent as I passed him, his eyes following my every step. I felt the weight of his stare and the unspoken questions between us, yet I remained silent, determined not to speak. His words halted me as I reached for the door, my fingers barely brushing the latch, still reeling from the kiss and struggling to make sense of my own thoughts. I couldn't trust myself to talk to him at this moment. He said, "We're doing this now," in a demanding rather than an inquiring tone. I turned slowly, my heartbeat accelerating as I looked into his eyes. I could no longer hold back or hesitate. With a dark and determined expression in his eyes, he stood a few paces away. Since there was no purpose in denying it, I didn't respond. His energy filled the room between us, bearing down on me as he drew closer. His eyes darted to the door and back to me, but I wasn't trying to escape since we were done waiting. With a quiet, concentrated voice, he whispered. I got to my feet. He had no hesitation, no doubt, only the sheer will to take what had been building between us. His kiss had awakened something deep inside me, a desire I had been fighting for so long that now unleashed it consumed every thought. There was my uneven breath. My body pressed firmly against his as his grip tightened around me. The room seemed smaller now, the space between us non-existent. My hands clutched his shirt, twisting into the fabric as his mouth met mine again, more firmly this time. His hands moved from my waist to the small of my back, their fingers hard, drawing me closer. His kissing style was hungry, reflecting a strong longing that was similar to mine. The heat between us was oppressive. I didn't want an escape, but there was none. But I was happy about it. I felt the warmth of his breath against my skin, followed by the gentle pressure of his lips and then the heat of his tongue. He whispered, "We're not stopping," against my skin in a low, gravelly voice that was full of assurance. "I know," I said, my voice hardly audible, my mind racing with the intensity of the moment, and there was no going back now, no space for second thoughts. "I wanted more, you're beautiful," he said in a raspy, need-filled murmur. I didn't want to stop. No question in his eyes or in his words. He wanted me completely. He muttered, "Tell me what you want," his voice low and his breath hot against my ear. "I want you," I mumbled back, my voice trembling with need. The sound of tires crunching on gravel reverberated through the quiet night, and the distant rumble of an engine brought everything crashing back. I felt him tense above me, his body stiffening as reality intruded on our carefully constructed bubble, and they backed off. "I want all of you" was all he needed to hear, and within a second he was moving again, his hands working quickly, sliding my jeans down my legs, leaving me bare beneath him. His eyes raked over me, filled with a hunger that made my heart race even faster. He spoke in a tight, frustrated voice, and I felt as though I had been punched in the stomach by what he said. His parents, all of a sudden I felt the full force of the situation. He sat up quickly, pulling away from me, and I felt the cold air rush in to fill the space he left behind. His movements were frantic now, a stark contrast to the slow, deliberate way he had touched me just moments before he grabbed his shirt from the floor, yanking it over his head in one swift motion. His eyes dark with a mixture of panic and anger. We had been so consumed by our own desires. I hurried to sit up as well, wrapping the blanket around myself in an attempt to collect my thoughts, but my head was racing. What were we thinking? My pulse raced once again as the sound of the vehicle door slamming outside reverberated through the walls, this time out of terror rather than want. His eyes darted to the window, and he clenched his hands, balling them at his sides, clearly frustrated by what we had just done. More to himself than to me, he said. We weren't supposed to get caught like this. Though I wasn't sure if I was attempting to comfort myself or him, I said, "They don't know. We can conceal it." His annoyance was evident and now emitted in waves as he interrupted me with a stronger tone than I had ever heard. "How long can we hide this, in your opinion?" As I opened my lips to reply, I realized that I had nothing to say. I hadn't given it much thought because we had been too engrossed in one another to consider the future. Next, and it was too late now. His mother's name was called downstairs, and her tone was cheerful and innocent. The sound of it made me feel twisted because I was an intruder threatening to ruin everything he had, including his family, his home, and his life. His eyes briefly shifted to the door, then back to me, and I could see the struggle between what he wanted and what he knew was right in his expression. Then just as quickly his face hardened. "We'll discuss it later," he said. He stood tugging on his trousers, his motions swift and seemingly furious, his speech clipped, emotion hidden beneath the surface. I watched him, feeling a mixture of fear and shame in my breast. I wanted to say anything to stop him, but I couldn't find the right words. I had never seen him this aloof and closed off before. He raked a hand through his hair, his movements harsh with rage. "Stay here," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact. He left me alone when the door clicked shut behind him, saying, "I'll take care of them." The room was quiet. For a few minutes, I sat there with the weight of everything bearing down on me, my heart thumping in my chest, and my mind racing with 1,000 unresolvable thoughts. I had known from the beginning that this would not end well, but I hadn't anticipated it to come to such a swift conclusion. I heard his parents' muffled voices asking how his evening had gone downstairs. His mother's laughter followed his father's deep voice, which was then steady and calm as if nothing had happened, as if we hadn't just crossed a line that would never be uncrossed. The minutes seemed to drag on for hours as I sat there waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart. I could hear footsteps coming up the stairs, And I wondered what he was saying. Was he already setting the stage for a lie? Or was he simply attempting to appear normal in the hopes that they wouldn't notice the tension in the air? My breath froze in my throat. He moved back into the room as the door creaked open, his face inscrutable. He whispered softly, "They're going to bed." His voice no longer filled with the fire it once contained, and then he closed the door behind him. He leaned against it for a while before his eyes finally met mine. As we gazed at one another, the weight of the recent events weighing on us, there was a heavy and pervasive tension in the air. After that, we carried on with our initial task. Great, really very great. For what seemed like minutes we were occupied, but when we were done I checked my watch and saw that 2 hours had gone by. He did something that surprised me because I hadn't felt this way in years. "This was an error," he stated. The remorse swept over me like a wave as he spoke in a strained, gentle voice, but before I could react, he shook his head and ran a hand through his hair. He responded hurriedly, "Not you again," his voice becoming softer. "I don't know how we're going to do this," he muttered clandestinely. Not knowing what to say, I swallowed hard. Although none of us knew the answers, it was obvious that things had just gotten considerably more convoluted as the situation's reality hit us both. He slowly turned away, and I stood there in the silence, aware that everything had changed. What had seemed indisputable now felt brittle. The moment passed, but its shadow remained, leaving behind a silent anxiety from which neither of us could recover.